Are we back with our shenanigans, Nola? For the bubbling of trouble. And I'm just gonna try to find you a few of my quotes. I have it on my Kindle, so it's like, where are my quotes on my Kindle? How do I get to those? That's what I want to learn today. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess, and Nola. Granola, my dog. If you're new to my channel, this is my dog Granola, and I'm Jess, and I'm here to talk about books that I read in April. This is part 2 of a 2-part wrap-up. If you want to check out part 1 of my April reading wrap-up, you can click the link in the description box, or I'll leave a card. So I think I'm just going to start out with the least to best. I don't know. I read some really good books. In the second part of my April wrap-up, I wanted to focus on transgirlapril. So I'll talk about Nevada, which I read for transgirlapril at the end of the video. So one of the books that I pulled from my wrapped TBR for April was Memorial by Bryan Washington. I had purchased this book last month around this time of the year because I had wanted to read it for Pride. And it had a lot of buzz around it, and I had waited for it to come out in paperback, and then I picked it up and I never got to it. So I ended up wrapping it and including it in my wrapped TBR, and it was the book that I pulled, I think actually for the month of March, and I ended up reading it in April, or finishing it in April, because it took me a really long time to read this book. I gotta tell you, this book dragged for me. It was not a book that I didn't have any problem with it, but it definitely dragged for me. I'll give you the quick synopsis. It's the story of Mike and Benson, who are in a relationship. Mike is Japanese American and Benson is Black, and they're in Houston, and I believe Benson is from Houston. They both have kind of family issues going on. At the beginning of the book, Benson's father was an alcoholic. Benson himself is HIV positive. And so they both present different struggles. Mike's father in Japan, still living in Japan, is dying, which we come to discover. And this plays a significant part of the story. Benson works in a daycare and Mike is a chef. There's a lot of food in the book, which I enjoyed. And the book really just revolves around their relationship and their family relationships. And I just really, really struggled to connect with the characters. I connected more with the character of Mike. And I think the reason for that is that in the story, Mike travels back to Japan to be with his dying father. And weirdly, this is such a strange book. The setup is that his mom has come to North America, and just as she's arriving from Japan in North America to stay with them, he's leaving to go be with his father, and I really didn't quite understand why that would be. First, I thought that was really interesting, and maybe there was going to be this interesting dynamic between Benson. I thought there was going to be this really interesting relationship between the Mother Mitsuko and Benson, and in the end, there kind of isn't. I guess this book is a slice of life story. It also has some interesting stuff around grief and relationships with your parents, particularly for Mike. But in terms of the gay relationship between Mike and Benson, they both end up cheating on each other. And Benson does that pretty quickly after Mike leaves. I guess he resents Mike leaving. And I don't know, I just really did not have a good sense of these characters. I wanted to and was pretty excited to read this book, but in the end it was a real disappointment, I must say. I don't want to give up on Bryan Washington. I've heard that his first book, which I'm not sure if it's a poetry collection or a set of stories, is quite good, called Lot. And I may pick it up at some point, but I just was really struggled. It took me really 2 months to read this book, which is unusual for me. We don't really know, I guess, if they love each other or not, and they don't really know if they love each other or not, or if they really want to be in the relationship or not. It seems it's very strange. But even that conflict for them about their relationship was really difficult for me to grasp. like everything was so understated, everything was so subtle that it really went under when I didn't get it. So it wasn't, I don't think it was well enough written for me to understand, or maybe it was that I'm missing some context to be able to understand the stories that are being told here, which is entirely possible. But yeah, this was not a very good read for me. And I was super disappointed, very disappointed in this one. Yeah, I guess I won't say anything more about Memorial. You can let me know in the comments below if you read Memorial and if you really enjoyed it. I'd be curious to hear. I just kept thinking it was going to get better, as you do when you don't DNF. So I also read The Swimmers by Julie Otsuka, which was so good. It's a short little book, but I really enjoyed it. It was really sad. It was really sad, the second half of this book. It's kind of, to me, it was divided into two different halves. The first half of the book is about a community pool and the swimmers that go there, and the way the pool kind of operates and the way the individual characters operate at the pool. If you've ever been to a community pool, you might get a sense of what that's like. There's a fast lane, a middle lane, a slow lane. There are people who have their kind of rituals around their swim. There are people who you instinctively know you need to give extra space to. There's all these sort of unwritten norms and rules about the use of the pool, and she captures that really beautifully in the first part of this book, and I just really had a really nice time reading it. And then something happens about midway through the book where a crack appears in the local community pool, and everyone's very distressed about how did the crack appear, what's going to happen with the crack, was it there the day before? And I think that she uses this crack in the pool as, well, she definitely uses it as a segue into the second half of the story, which is about one of the characters, one of the women who uses the pool, a woman named Alice, who's suffering from Alzheimer's. And it shifts to the story of Alice and Alice's family and the struggle that they have with dementia, or the experience that they have with, Alzheimer's dementia. But also the community grapples with this crack in the pool, and the pool ends up closing. And I think, to me, it was just such a good way of presenting that experience, just coming from my own personal experience of having two parents who, if you don't know, if you haven't been around my channel very long, both of my parents, my father who died last year and my mother who's currently still alive, suffer from dementia. Two very different types of dementia. So just this idea that life can be going on, you can have your routines, you've adapted, you've got your space. The pool is kind of like this place where people can be their real selves. And I mean, there's a lot more to say about the first part of the book. She definitely packs a lot into this story. And then something can happen, something in the infrastructure cracks, and then things sort of deteriorate. And I think that was really well done. The other thing that struck me about this book is when I got into the second half, the first part of the second half, it's the second chapter in the second half, is completely devoted to a place called Bella Vista, which is wild to me because the residence where my mom lives is called Vista. I'm not even joking. And this description of this residence, I'll just read it to you. If anyone has any experience of this, you're going to recognize it right away. Like, it's so wild, the description here, because when I was reading it, I was like, that's exactly my mom's residence. So this idea that all of these residences are the same no matter where you go, wild. So it reads, as our newest admission to Bella Vista, there are a few things you should know. You will wake up when we decide you will wake. You will sleep when we put you down and turn off the lights. All seating in the dining room is assigned. If you require more than the allotted 42 minutes to finish your food, you may request a seat at one of our slow eater tables. Do not wander the halls late at night looking for your husband or children. Your husband is sound asleep in the big empty bed. Your children are grown and scattered across the globe. Do not try to open the windows. The windows do not open. Or mindlessly punch random numbers into the coded lock by the elevator doors. The code is uncrackable. If you fail to remain compliant, we may have to give you a pill. If you resist your customized care plan, we may have to give you a pill. If you refuse to take your pill, we may have to give you a pill plus, depending on the degree of your intransigence and injection. Hoarding is prohibited. Socks are imperative. The door to your room must remain open at all times. If you follow the rules and maintain a cheerful demeanor, you may be selected as our next resident of the month. Whew, like, it's upsetting. I'm laughing out of not nervousness, but just laughing because it's that whole, if you don't laugh, you'll cry. It's so upsetting what happens to people and how we treat people who have cognitive decline. It's unbelievable. They lose any sense of themselves. And so contrasted to the pool, which is this place where everybody can exist as their true selves, this restriction of being put into this residence for Alice is pretty dramatic. She just does such a good job of presenting it, and it's pretty upsetting. I found it really sad. I know that we don't have perfect solutions, but I don't think that the solutions that we have are good enough. I really don't. Anyway, there's more that I could read from here. I tabbed a couple of other things, but I think that's all I'll say about it for now. I think it's well worthwhile to pick this book up and give it a go. It's not the easiest book to read, but to me it was very impactful, and I'm really glad I read it. Oh, it was so sad. Whew. Oh, it was so sad. So sad. What we do in society, how it reflects who we are as a people, is so important for us to be thinking about, even if it's something that's not affecting us at this very moment. I realize that I'm upset about that because it's affecting me, but I think it's just important for us to be thinking about what kind of society we want to create and what kind of society we want to be living in. Which brings me to good segue, right? Which brings me to Women Talking. I don't think I'm going to say too much about Women Talking because I did a whole reading vlog about it. Women Talking by Miriam Taves is based on a true event in a Mennonite colony where women were being raped in the middle of the night by a small group of men who were sneaking into their homes and attacking them. And they were waking up in the morning with bruises, and they were told that it was their imagination, that they were ghosts, that they were demons that were coming into their homes and attacking them. And this story is an imaginary telling of what the women of the community would have done under those circumstances. It does take the form of a kind of a play. A male character named August is taking the minutes of the meeting that the women have decided to convene in order to decide on. They had voted. The vote was to stay and do nothing, to stay and fight, and the third was to leave. And there is a kind of a tie between staying and fighting and leaving, and they end up in this meeting, some of the women of the community, to kind of hash it out, have a discussion about what's the final decision going to be. And August is asked, he's a school teacher in the community, and he's asked to be the minute taker. And the conversation is recorded by August, and this is the main part of the book. And I think that's all I'm going to say about it for now. It's fantastic. It's really well done. I made a vlog where I watched the film and read the book, so if you want to hear more about my thoughts on it, you can check out the vlog. I think what impacted me the most about this was just the intensity with which the women's instincts were to protect other people, to maintain community. Their instincts were very kind of noble, but at the same time, they had to grapple with this horrible oppression that they were experiencing, and also they had to grapple with the kind of evil in their community of how do you respond to something that should be maybe punished, or how do we control this kind of behavior? Is it possible even? And then, of course, dealing with the oppression of their religion, and there's a lot of exploration of faith and the way that religion can be used as a tool to oppress people, and that was also really interesting. Lots to dive into there. I would highly recommend this book. Really enjoyed reading it. It was quite emotional, but a very, very good read. Next, I'm going to talk about Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. This was longlisted for the Women's Prize this year, and in fact has, since I've read it, been shortlisted. I really enjoyed this book. The story follows Kushla, a 24-year-old school teacher, and a man named Michael, who's 30 years her senior, who she falls in love with, or has an affair with. I'm not sure about love. I think she thinks she's in love with him. And it's set during the Troubles. And her brother, Eamon, owns a bar, a pub, where she sometimes works as well. And her mother, Gina, is a kind of barely functioning alcoholic that Kushla also finds herself taking care of. The bar where she sometimes works, owned by her brother, is often, like, there are often soldiers there, Protestant soldiers, despite the fact that Kushla's family is Catholic. So there's a lot of mixing in the community between Catholic and Protestant. And that kind of sets the backdrop, the bubbling of drama that it just kind of boils beneath the surface in the beginning of the book. It's presented as a love story or an affair. And Michael is Protestant. He's a barrister. He is one of those characters who isn't aligned based on one side or the other with the conflict. He's defending men in circumstances who are Catholic, who might have prejudices against them. And Kushla is Catholic. So there's a little bit of that. The power dynamic between Kushla and Michael, I think, has turned people off of the book a little bit. I've definitely heard people criticizing it because of the age difference. And I think that there's also something being said here around the class difference. He's obviously a lawyer, she's a teacher. She's not in a low class. There are children in her class who are more of working class, in particular a little boy named Davy, whose mother and father are Protestant and Catholic, and he is bullied because of that. I won't get too far into that story. So Louise Kennedy is exploring class differences in Ireland, as well as the dynamic between men and women. This is set in 1975, so I think the dynamic between men and women was a little bit different. Kushla gets into this relationship with a man who's old enough to be her father, and the mother doesn't seem to have a big issue with it. Nobody seems to have a big issue with it. I think it was a different time, so sort of condoning that sort of thing was the norm. So that is really interesting. Kushla is asked by Michael to teach in like kind of a salon style Irish language sessions with his friends, and she comes, and it sort of seems like that he's kind of fetishizing a little bit her true Irish roots. That I thought was pretty interesting. So yeah, definitely blurred lines about this identity, and then the implications of your identity as Irish Catholic or as Protestant. And it's interesting because almost every chapter opens with sort of what seems like a kind of a news headline, and as the book goes on, it gets a little bit more and more intense. And I think she's done a good job of kind of making us feel like what it felt like you're going about your daily life. Of course, you have these class differences, and you have this relationship happening for Kushla with Michael. The story is through Kushla's eyes, through her experience. And then sort of bubbling beneath the surface is this whole implication of violence and the Troubles and the potential for violence. And as we move on through the story, the potential for violence just gets greater and greater and greater and greater. And I just thought it was really well executed. I thought it was really good and enjoyed it very, very much. I kept wanting to get home so I could get back to reading the book. So I really recommend it. It might not be for everyone, and there may be people who feel that, oh, I've already read books set in this time period. The only other book that I've read that's set during the Troubles is Milkman, and although I really liked Milkman and I thought it was well done, it was completely different, and it was written in a way that I found was a little bit less accessible. It took me longer to read. It was stream of consciousness. It was a different style altogether. This is a little bit more accessible, and so I think maybe for that reason I enjoyed it even more. I did think the other interesting thing about this is that because she's a school teacher, sometimes that subtlety of the bubbling fear or state of fear that's subconscious was brought to the fore by comments that the students sometimes made in class. Things like, oh, you know, we had to check under the car for a bomb before leaving for school today, that sort of thing. Just there's a lot of things that I think I would go back to and maybe reflect on or might still be thinking about for this book. And like I said, I'd like to hear what other people thought who've read it. I know some people didn't like it. I'd love to hear sort of what you didn't like about it. If you didn't like Trespasses, I'm really curious to know, because for me it was really engaging and I really thought it was fantastic. And the last book I'm going to talk about is for Trans Girl April. I read Nevada by Imogen Binnie. I have to say that this wasn't wasn't my favorite read of the month, not by a stretch, but I'm quite glad that I read it. It's one of two books that I read for Trans Girl April. The other book that I read was Tell Me I'm Worthless by Allison Rumpf, which was more of a horror story, and I really enjoyed that one. Nevada tells a story of Maria, who's just she's pretty cool. She's a trans woman who has just broken up with her girlfriend, Steph, who was kind of manipulative and probably not the best person for her. She works in a bookstore in New York City, and the thing about this book is it was interesting. So Nevada was really interesting in that there were a lot of times where we're in Maria's head. Maria's trying to figure out where she fits in, who she is, where does she belong, still really struggling with identity, and also talking a lot about the experience of being trans, the kinds of messages that trans people are given and the way that they see themselves in society. It was really interesting to read all of that, but because I think the author was writing, this author was writing this book for a specific audience, even though I learned a lot from reading it and I appreciated the book. This author wrote this book, and she says so in the notes at the end of the book. It's really written for people who are trans or maybe are curious about being trans, and it's really written for a particular audience. I think for myself, as a hetero, white, middle-aged woman, it's really great that I read it, and I would recommend that everybody read it because I did learn so much about that experience. It really humanizes the experience and brings to light a lot of the issues that are created out of the trans experience and the way that trans people are treated. And the story itself was good, but because there was so much that needed to be done in the regard of education and reflection, I think that some of the story was lost. Like, the story felt like a vehicle for being able to have a conversation or provide some insight for people into what it means when you're not sure if you're trans. So let me just say, the story follows Maria out of this breakup with Steph, and she decides that she's been responsible her whole life. She's done all the right things. It hasn't really paid off for her. And now she wants to throw caution to the wind, and she's going to go on a road trip to Nevada and just sort of say, fuck everything. And she goes. And she ends up stopping off at a Walmart not far from Reno, and she sees a boy working there, a young man working there, and she sort of thinks that guy might be interested in either is trans or has curiosity about being trans, and I could really help them. And so she initiates a conversation with him, and they end up, it's almost not plausible to me the way the story goes, but I understand that the story is the vehicle for something much bigger and much more important. So they end up going together, James and Maria is able to at least begin the conversation with James about his gender identity and you know, thoughts he might have and what Maria's experience was like. And from that perspective, it's really an important book, and it was really interesting, and I really do appreciate it. I think it was a really important book. I mean, there's some fantastic stuff in here about the prejudice against trans people. This is about Maria before she figured out that she was trans. She got involved in high school with sort of the deadbeats and started taking a lot of drugs. And she says, anyway, she hadn't figured out she was trans. All she knew about trans people was all anybody knows about trans people before they start looking, that they are all psychos with big hair who trick straight men into having sex with them. She just knew that she felt weird, but literally every teenager feels weird. Who doesn't feel weird? All the music she listened to was about feeling weird. All the books she read were about feeling weird. So when she was 17, it didn't seem strange to hang out with like a kid who was really into racism and another, a future truck stop mechanic in a tent with a ton of flannel and a bottle of Everclear or a dozen hits of acid in a cow pasture. That was just like what you did. So she's talking about how she had all of these experiences of feeling like she didn't fit in just like every other kid, but she didn't know anything about the idea of being trans or how to relate to that. She talks about how everybody cool was weird, and this is how she mythologized her sense of being trans without understanding that she was trans. It's really interesting. Really, really interesting. And then in the next chapter, she writes more about this, the stereotyping. She writes that stereotype about transsexuals being all wild and criminal and bold and outside the norm, and like engendering in the townsfolk the courage to break free from the smothering constraints of conformity. That stereotype is about drag queens. Maria is transsexual, and she is so meek she might disappear. So she's also talking about how she didn't really find that she fit into this flamboyant idea of what it meant to be trans, and that confused her even more as a young person. See, I think this book is just so important, obviously. So good from that perspective. It really, really is good. It's not really about the plot of the story, it's about the representation of the experience. And some really fantastic writing. Like here's a line that she wrote about heroin, because heroin does play a part in the story. She says heroin, obviously it's kind of a big deal. Heroin is the cul-de-sac at the end of Drug Street. I really did enjoy the writing. I thought the writing was great. And the characterization is fantastic. The fact that trans people are comedy, that they're the butt of jokes. This idea that you learn from the television that a man in a dress is a hilarious, funny thing, and that he is still a man. It's so good. Even if he is wearing a dress, and nothing can change that, and nothing can change the fact that it's funny. Or you have an uncle who sees that you're wearing jelly bracelets when you're 6 or 7 years old. So he goes, wow, my nephew wearing girl jewelry, in a barely even mocking tone you internalize to mean not okay. Like all of these messages that trans people get, that the way that they are is wrong, is done very, very well in this book. And the misunderstanding, how much misunderstanding there is for trans people themselves about their own personhood and their own identity is truly masterfully presented in this book. So I'm so glad that I read Nevada by Imogen Binnie. And thank you so much to Kevy from Say Kevy and Willow from Books and Bow for creating the readathon and for hosting it. And I'll really look forward to reading more trans works throughout the year. I have a few to add to my TBR, and I just think it was a great initiative, and I'm really glad that you did it. So thanks for that. And that, my friends, perhaps lacking a little bit of focus. I'm a little distracted because my mom was admitted to hospital and I'm off to the hospital now. But I really wanted to come on and finish off my April wrap up. I'll do my best to keep up with my uploads, and everything's good. She's okay. We're just facing a lot of physiotherapy for about 6 weeks. Anyhow, so Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye! Let's say bye, Nola. Bye! Why am I always doubting myself when I'm in front of the camera? Is a chapter called, I don't know if it's the first part of the second half. No, the kinds of struggles that people have who are trans, the kinds of messages that trans people. And it really is really well, it's really, really well done. Gina's alcoholism is a response to her personal experience, I guess the loss of her husband. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, yeah, edit that out. I don't remember. Why is she an alcoholic? I don't remember. Somebody tell me in the comments below. Nola is chewing on my razor, guys. Back to the shenanigans. Back to the shenanigans.